Hello and welcome to today's LaRouche Organization Manhattan Town meeting for Saturday, April 23rd. Our topic today is China and a new security architecture, rejecting the algorithm of world war. Though this week's International Monetary Fund and World Bank meeting was confronted with the growing food insecurity of as many as 2 billion people around the world, by inflation rates of as much as 150% for essential commodities, and by an unresolved and under-researched global pandemic, the policy of committing ever-expanding amounts of money for the financing of war in Ukraine, or the rest of Europe for that matter, was left unchallenged. The City of London and Wall Street are pulling apart the United Nations Security Council and other post-World War II institutions in a desperate drive to either directly control or, if necessary, steal the physical and financial assets of the world at the barrel of a gun, if necessary. This is a kind of economic warfare that seeks to crush Russia now and others next, to prop up an intrinsically doomed financial system which cannot be saved. China has proposed an alternative to this in a series of 3 initiatives: the Global Development Initiative, the Global Health Initiative, and the Global Security Initiative, the latter of which was proposed just this week. Now, these initiatives are critical, or may be critical, to advancing a new security and development architecture, as recently discussed by the Schiller Institute at an April 9th conference devoted to that topic. We're going to be discussing this today, but before we get there, we just want to start with the news of something just out of Germany today from a group of academicians and former diplomats and others. And we're going to put this up on the screen so that you can hear at least part of their words. This has to do with the present unraveling circumstance globally around the threat of thermonuclear war. We are united in warning against an uncontrollable expansion of the war with unforeseen consequences for the entire world, and in opposing a prolongation of the war and bloodshed with arms deliveries. By supplying weapons, Germany and other NATO countries have de facto made themselves a party to the war, and thus Ukraine has also become the battleground for the conflict between NATO and Russia over the security order in Europe, which has been escalating for years. This brutal war in the middle of Europe is being fought on the backs of the Ukrainian population. The economic war now unleashed is at the same time endangering supplies for the people of Russia and many poor countries around the world. The war carries the real danger of an expansion and uncontrollable military escalation, similar to that in the First World War. Red lines are drawn, which are then crossed by actors and hazards on both sides. And the spiral is once again one step further. If responsible people like you, dear Chancellor Scholz, do not stop this development, we will end up with another big war. Only this time with nuclear weapons, widespread devastation, and the end of human civilization. We therefore call on the German government, the European Union, and NATO countries to stop supplying arms to Ukrainian troops and to encourage the government in Kiev to end military resistance in exchange for assurances of negotiations on a ceasefire and a political solution. Negotiations on the rapid withdrawal of Russian troops and the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity should be supported by NATO countries' own proposals regarding legitimate security interests of Russia and its neighbors. And it's signed by Hans Christoph Graf von Schmonek, former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations Organization, and Dr. Antje Vollmer, former Vice President of the German Bundestag, and other academicians, artists, churchmen, and news people. So we are beginning to see in different parts of the world a kind of resistance to the madness and the way in which we seem to be on what some people have referred to as the algorithm of war, a kind of self-reinforcing process in which statements are made, which then cause actions to be taken, which cause other statements to be made. And we don't seem to get to an end of this. Now, to discuss what China is thinking about this and how it impacts the global scene, we have Bill Jones of Executive Intelligence Review, who's going to discuss not just the 3 Chinese initiatives, but how they taken as a whole could provide the basis for a dialogue of nations that could transcend and resolve the present crisis, potentially even thwarting the City of London and Wall Street's financial world war. So, Bill, glad to have you here to sort of unpack this situation, tell us both what's going on and what could happen as a result. Go right ahead.
Well, what we see today at the IMF meetings is, I would call it the chickens coming home to roost, where even Janet Yellen, who last week was warning China that they changed their position with regard to Russia, they also would be subject to sanctions. Today, she's saying that perhaps we should eliminate some of the sanctions against Chinese goods because it's leading to a terrible amount of inflation, that we don't have access to these goods. She also made a comment that perhaps Europe should not go overboard in restricting Russian oil. So what we're seeing there is the fact of the reality that is starting to hit, which was caused not specifically by the war itself, but by the reaction to the war with the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. This attempt really to decouple Russia entirely. And the most important development in the last couple of days, of course, was President Xi's speech yesterday at the Boao Forum, International Forum, which is held every year on the Hainan Island, the southernmost part of China, to discuss the economic issues. And it was the opportunity for Xi to actually address himself to the international crisis facing the world, and saying a few words about what the options really are here. He said he made the proposal of creating a global security initiative, which of course reflects directly what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been saying in the last few webcasts that we've been holding internationally, calling for a new security architecture. And now China has really put forward a concrete proposal for dealing with this. I have something that Jose can put up in a minute. I will just say, give some quotes here, which I do not have a picture of. But he said it has been proven time and again that the Cold War mentality would only wreck the global peace framework, that hegemonism and power politics would only endanger world peace, and that bloc confrontation would only exacerbate security challenges in the 21st century. To promote security for all in the world, China would like to propose a global security initiative. And he goes on to mention some of the aspects of this, which have been a part of the Chinese dialogue on security issues for some time, but now come wrapped up in a very concrete proposal for changing the rules of the game with regard to the security situation for humanity. He says territorial integrity and sovereignty should be protected, non-interference in internal affairs of other nations, respecting the independent choices of development paths and social systems which are made by the individual countries. That is, one size does not fit all. Given differences in culture, differences in traditions, differences in social norms, each country has really got to find its own development path on the basis of its own history, and that must be respected. The only criteria you have to look at is, does this benefit the people of that nation? Are they better off by adopting the changes that they themselves have made? This is what he says on that. Staying committed, of course, to the principles and purposes of the UN Charter. China has been the most consequent and vociferous in defending the notion of the post-war world as it was designed by Franklin Roosevelt and as it was incorporated in the UN Charter. Reject Cold War mentality, oppose unilateralism, and say no to what they call group politics and bloc confrontation, and stay and uphold the principle of indivisible security. That is, that each country must have security. One country cannot have security at the cost of another country's. That is the basic principles. And if Jose has the statement, I'll just quickly, with regard to the decoupling, he says, regarding this, the crisis in Europe, and regarding the U.S. and the West's policy towards Russia, where they're trying to really push them out of the international system, either to get a revolt or a color revolution, or just to keep them out of access to the world economy. He says, in this day and age, the international community has evolved so much that it has become a sophisticated and integrated apparatus. Acts to remove any single part will cause serious problems to its operation. When that happens, both the victims and initiators of that action, of such acts, will stand to lose. In today's world, unilateralism and excessive pursuit of self-interest are doomed to fail. So are the practices of decoupling. Actually, is a new Chinese word for this now. I think haven't figured out what it is, but it's something they've invented now to cover this. Supply disruption and maximum pressure. These are doomed to fail. So are the attempts to forge small circles, like the so-called Alliance of Democracies, or to stoke conflict and confrontation along ideological lines. Instead, we need to embrace a global governance that emphasizes extensive consultation, joint contribution, shared benefits, and promote the common values of humanity, and advocate exchanges and mutual learning between civilizations. This is something that, of course, we've been talking about, that Helga Zepp-LaRouche, in her statements at the recent forums, has been insistent on that. And of course, this has been the overall policy of Lyndon LaRouche during the whole course of his career, was to bring the world in that direction. And that's what the Chinese and the Chinese president has put himself behind. So it's really a remarkable shift here that has given strength to the efforts that the Schiller Institute and the forces of LaRouche and their friends have been working for many, many years. You know, people talk about being on the right side of history. And I'd like to just elaborate a little bit on this, because obviously history has a direction. But that direction is not determined outside of human actions. If human actions are detrimental to the existence of humanity, as for instance, pushing the world into a nuclear war at which humanity ends, history is over. Obviously, this is not a point that an end of history, or that the side of history that one should be on. But it's determined by what we do. And what is history, however? I mean, if it's to continue, then humanity must continue. And of course, what is it that necessitates that humanity continues? Well, following the laws that were laid out by Lyndon LaRouche, this means that we have the capability of supporting a growing population. But in order to do that, as LaRouche said, we must have continual innovation in technologies so that we do not end up in a situation that would be what we call limited resources, in which we no longer have enough to support a growing population, and therefore must decrease our population, as Pastor Malthus had said several hundred years ago. So that being on the right side of history means that you are on the side of pushing humanity forward by securing enough food, by securing the goods of life, so that people can develop their own capabilities, particularly their intellectual capabilities, in which they too can contribute to this development of innovation in which mankind moves forward. And if you're in support of that, you are on the right side of history, because the other side leads simply to complete devastation. And so I think when we're looking at this crisis within the world as a whole, we have to admit that what President Xi has put out, which we have been insisting upon for a long time, is really the only direction that mankind can go. Unfortunately, of course, in the United States, this is not the general outlook, at least of the political forces that are in charge today. They're really looking at the world. I mean, if you look at the world in a certain way through rose-colored glasses or through black glasses, everything's going to be tinged by the way you're looking at it. What our political elites are doing at the present moment, that is primarily the political elites of the West, they're looking at the world situation through the lens of the Cold War, something that the British have been foisting upon the United States ever since they initiated the Cold War with the death of Franklin Roosevelt, who was, aside from John F. Kennedy, really the last representative of what we might call the American system, as distinct from the British system, and that has really infected, like an infectious disease, most of our political entities. However, on the part of the American people, this is not the case. We have not imbued ourselves with this British ideology. And if you look at a couple of events that happened during the course of the week, which I found were very important, there was a visit by the new Chinese ambassador, new, I say, he's been there here for about 6 or 7 months, to Des Moines, Iowa, to attend a major agricultural event, which is sponsored by the China Heartland Association. This is a group in the Midwest around the farming communities who have, over a period of decades, have had extremely good relations with China, because we've been selling a lot of food to China. We have a lot of agricultural produce including soybeans, which are going to China. And the farmers in particular have been hardest hit by these tariffs, because it's making it really more difficult for them. But he went there, and it was extraordinary. I think he's been very active, and he's been meeting with all sorts of people all over the country. And he met with these farmers, and they were just so excited by the meeting. In fact, Iowa is an interesting place, because Iowa is probably the place that President Xi Jinping knows better than any other place in the United States. He was there as a younger man, as a younger student, and he stayed with people who were living in the capital, or one of the cities of Iowa. I can't remember the name now, but they have restored that. The people in the city have restored that house and have kept that room exactly as President Xi Jinping had it when he was here. And it's like a monument there. So the ambassador was able to visit them. There were all kinds of stories about that visit by President Xi. President Xi, when he was vice president of China several years ago, returned to Iowa to meet many of the friends that he had made at that time, and also to see his old stamping grounds. And he was very happy about that. So they have this tradition, and they were very excited about this. And you don't find that anywhere in the United States, where President Xi is being portrayed as kind of a man who wants to take over the world. But there you see, I think, what is underneath the surface in the mentality of Americans. Now, you look at some of the figures, and there are a lot of polls have been done, even Chinese polls, regarding how Americans view China. And the attitude has become more and more negative. But I think it's simply because of the intense propaganda that people just don't really think, and they hear this thing and they hear that thing, and they read the newspapers and they say, oh, things can't be so good. But underneath the surface, I think what you'll find as you talk to people who know the issues, as the people in Iowa who follow this do know that it's very beneficial that what we are doing with China, I mean, the trade we have with China is extremely beneficial, and who also see the work and the ideas of President Xi Jinping as an extremely positive force, because they're not looking through the lens of the British imperial control mechanism that the political elites have. So in one sense, that's obviously what we have to tap into in order to move forward on this. But I think you really have to understand the situation that we're in at this point is indeed a turning point. The United States is opposed, officially at any rate, is opposed to China and opposed to Russia because they want to change the way the system works. They do not accept the rules of the road that as they have been dictated by the Western alliance over the period of the last 40 years. But what are those rules of the road, and how have they benefited people? What has happened? Look around you. Look around at what has happened to the economy of the United States. Look at the families in the United States. Once upon a time, we had, the head of the household had a job which supported the whole family, and you had big families in those days, probably bigger than today, 6, 7, 8 people. This was not unusual. And on one job, and the mother was usually at home taking care of the home and everything, and obviously the role of women has changed, so they're out working too. But they're out working now because they have to, because one wage no longer supports a family. And in fact, even 2 wages. And children who get jobs sometimes still have to live with their parents because they can't afford house. It's all gone downhill. And that's here in the United States of America, which allegedly was the most prosperous country during those 40 years and setting those rules of the road. But if you look at the developing countries, it's disastrous. It's a total disaster for them. Starvation. Well, they say now because of the COVID, 200 million people are in danger of starvation. Now they say because of the economic effects of the sanctions, of the war in Ukraine, could be 1 billion people and on starving. What are these rules of the road? What benefit have they given to humanity? What China is saying and what it has said, it doesn't want to change our system. It doesn't want to institute a National People's Congress and a People's Consultative Committee in the United States. They don't want to change our Congress. We may want to change our Congress more than they do. They're quite happy with, we decide how we want to do it. But they do want to have a world in which is equitable, in which you don't have a growing contrast between the very rich and the very poor, with the very poor getting even poorer. They also want to have a world in which every country has a right to say and to determine, in one sense, its own fate, and not be superimposed by some kind of a system that has been developed in Washington or one of the academies in the United States or in Great Britain, which doesn't apply, which has no relevance to that country at hand. There's neither to its social system or to its structure. And so they're calling for this. And they're calling for it not in terms of changing everything up. They're calling for it in terms of what they regard as the most important thing, the rules of the road that were set out by the Roosevelt idea of the United Nations, the UN Charter including that. And that this is something that would be extremely beneficial if anybody looked at, if anybody took off those lenses that say that we have to lay out the rules of the road. They would say, hey, this is a reasonable system. It's consistent with our American Constitution, with the general welfare. Where has the general welfare gone to? It's gone really to hell in a handbasket by most of the economic decisions that have been made. And it will be even more so because of the reaction that the people have had to these the war in Ukraine, which was essentially a war between the rules of the road of the United States and the security interests of Russia. And Russia made that very clear for years, saying, look, we have to have our own security. All these other countries, fine, they should have their security too, but we don't want this growing military alliance on our borders. And unfortunately, it was, President Clinton that started the ball rolling, because at the end of the Cold War, we could have, said, okay, let's get rid of Warsaw Pact is over, NATO alliance should be over, let's get rid of both of them, and let's try and have a Europe in which Russia is integrated. But they never did that, because you had the pressure from people here saying, oh, we don't know where Russia's going to go, so we got to have this alliance. And you had all these very small countries on the border of Russia that had been, become a part of the European Union, who said, we insist that we must be a part of NATO alliance because we will never trust Russia. And that became like the tail that wagged the dog. I mean, the whole European Union went in that direction with the support and goodwill of the United States. And that's where we're at now. So it's a critical juncture. And it's a critical juncture in which this initiative that has been taken up by obviously one of the most important, if not the most important country in the world, China, is something that we can now build on. And I think the task at hand now is to try and tap into that sense in the American population where the real notion of U.S.-China relations and what they mean for the U.S. economy can become uppermost in their minds, rather than all this political hype that's been going on recently attacking China. And I think the fact that the economic situation, as we see in the IMF meeting today, that the chickens are coming home to roost. The decisions that have been made are going to lead to a deteriorating situation for Americans all throughout the country and for the world as a whole. And you're going to see a lot of ferment, a lot of concern, a lot of dissension, where people are saying, what the heck is going on here? And, what direction should we really go? And that gives us really the opportunity to take this initiative and to take, the appeals, what Helga's been saying on this, and bring it to the American people, and to mobilize people and groups and organizations, as we saw in this initiative that Dennis talked about today. There's also a force within the United States that can be organized in this way to bring to bear those who are not looking through the lens of the British Empire, but who are looking at it from the sense of American citizens, concerned American citizens about the fate of America and about the fate of the world, that their influence has also got to be brought to bear in this way, so that we can turn around these lemmings in Washington who are heading for the cliff because we don't want to go over it.
Okay, Bill, I thank you for that. There's several things that have come up already, but I want to do the following. I want to go to a clip that we have from a discussion earlier in the week done by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, discussing with Harley Schlanger her conception and the conference that she organized to begin the initiation of the idea of advancing a new security and development architecture. I want to get your comments on this, and just say to everybody that is watching that you might want to, if you have questions or comments, we'll have something that will scroll along the bottom of your screen so you know how you can get in touch with us to do that. But let's roll that section from Helga now. Yeah, we've got the banner there. Send the questions at LaRoucheOrganization.com. But if we can just roll that discussion, which we had a little bit earlier in the week.
Naturally, we presented solutions, the idea to have a new international security architecture in the tradition of the Peace of Westphalia. And then we provided the kind of programmatic solution for a new world economic order based on development with very concrete proposals. And I think this is really important because, you have now all kinds of people, commenting on the situation in Ukraine, more weapons, more this, more that. But, what is most needed is an organization, an institution which actually thinks of how do we end this war? Because, you have the warmongers like the Senator Coons from the United States, from Delaware, who is advocating US weapons on the ground in Ukraine, which is a clear suicide idea of bringing the world to World War III as quickly as possible. You have all these people like Borrell from the EU, von der Leyen, and unspeakable people I don't even want to start characterizing because I get really extremely emotional about it, who say more weapons, more weapons. The war, Russia must be prevented from winning the war. What does that mean? It means, that you fight the war until the last Ukrainian or until World War III. So, I think we need a radical, different approach, namely that, we have to get to the negotiation table. The war has to end. Any more hour the war continues is only, at the disadvantage of the Ukrainian people. And then we have to have a real architecture which allows a solution. And that is what our conference provided. And I can only encourage you to take the time one evening or one weekend and look at the whole program, because you will find an amazing combination of people agreeing with this approach. And we do not intend to stop with this conference, but we are expanding the process of building an alliance of people who want to have a new paradigm.
And what's clear is if you want to have such an event occur, you need to have a very diverse group of speakers who come from different countries, different continents, but share a common agreement that we can't continue in the direction that we're going. I think one of the interesting indications of the power of the event was the article in Politico, which talked about the isolation of the Russian ambassador Antonov, but then noted that he spoke at the Schiller conference.
Yes, I think the establishment is trying to isolate Russia. But we gave Ambassador Antonov a platform which is not only reaching a lot of people inside the United States, but internationally. So they were probably, I don't know if they were more freaked out about Ambassador Antonov or about the Schiller Institute, but in any case, it's good that they are worried.
Well, and one of the other indications that they're worried was this article that will be in the Economist magazine on April 22nd, which talks about the realignment and talks about something that you repeatedly bring up, that there are more people in more countries who are opposing the Anglo-American war drive than are supporting it. And I think this is quite interesting that this came out. And at the same time, we're seeing finally some people who are providing proper analysis of what's going on militarily. Jacques Bowie, you mentioned, from the Swiss intelligence, Mal Brunet, a French reporter. Why don't you give us a sense of where you think this battle in the inside battle in Ukraine is headed?
Well, I mean, what people should be aware of is that what nowadays is called fake news, that has been part of any warfare since millennia. When you have a war, then, each side develops their narrative and they're trying to, demoralize the other side and remoralize their own ranks. And, that makes it very difficult for people who believe in the news of the day, because the news of the day is what is the result of this information war, which the Rand Corporation and many other think tanks, they have spent enormous studies on how to make the information war an integral part of war fighting. And therefore, it is very important that now more and more real military experts are coming out and they give pieces, of what leads to the truth. For example, this Jacques Beau, who is a Swiss security expert, he actually provided some information which already came from Russian sources before, but he is now, from a Swiss standpoint, confirming it, that what really started the war was not the 24th of February with the Russian military invasion in Ukraine, but that from the 17th of February onward, the Ukrainian army had increased by 30 times the attacks on the Donbass, shelling and artillery and various other military action, so that Putin finally was convinced that that was the offensive and there was no other way than to engage in the combat as it occurred. Then you have another important security expert, Mal Bruno, who writes for the Figaro, who said that he came just back from the front in Ukraine, and he saw it with his own eyes, that British SAS and US Delta forces were in command of the fighting in Ukraine. Now, these are all very important informations you don't get when you just read the newspaper or listen to the TV news, but it really shows that this is a war which has a completely different dimension. It's not what the media say, the madman Putin, who all of a sudden decided to conquer first Ukraine and then the rest of Europe. This is a completely different story. It is a war between those forces led by the British and the United States, who have turned actually Europe into vassals, who are trying to maintain an unipolar world by conducting economic warfare against Russia, and in a certain sense China is on the list, who want to prevent what they call a multipolar world. But the reality is this unipolar world does not exist anymore. It is gone. And what these media coverages completely are hiding is that there have been changes taking place, as President Xi Jinping always says these days, as they have not occurred since 100 years. And, this is indeed very remarkable, because what the sanctions against Russia have done in the very short period of time since the war started, they have forced Russia to completely reorientate. The partnership with China is being strengthened, but also India, Indonesia, South Africa, Nigeria, Pakistan, all of these countries do not want to choose. So half of the African countries have refused to take sides. There was supposed to be a meeting of 10 South Asian countries, which the United States named to be a top priority to take place. This has been postponed indefinitely for the same reason. So you have some few countries who side with the United States, like Japan. The new prime minister, or relatively new prime minister, Kishida, just copied the sanctions of the United States and applied them to Russia, and that way ruining the relationship between Japan and Russia, which had been built over many years by Prime Minister Abe before. So that's the only real change in the direction of the United States. But you have a complete reorientation. For example, if you look at the situation, the United States has lost practically all influence in the Middle East. You have Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, other countries who are really orienting more in the direction of working, with the SCO, with the BRICS. The BRICS themselves are being revitalized. The relationship between Russia and India. India is refusing to bend to the pressure to break a relation with Russia. A new currency is developing. What the sanctions and the trust in the dollar is disappearing to the extent that the US is confiscating the assets of other countries. They did it with Afghanistan with 9 billion. Then they did it with 300 billion of Russia. Now, many countries say maybe it's not so safe to keep your assets in dollars, and they're moving to have more trade in the national currencies, and that naturally is developing into a de-dollarized alternative financial system. Now, these are all changes which are caused uniquely by the policy of the West, and that is, a backlash which people are not thinking about. I mean, this is a complete destruction of the world order which existed in the post-war period, or even in the post-Soviet Union era. And there is a complete change. And, that should be the discussion. How do we find a solution, which prevents that this multipolarity goes into a new geopolitical confrontation and ends with World War III? And that's what we try to discuss with our conference.
Okay, so Bill, I just want you to respond to what you heard there. We have some questions and so on, but just wanted to give you a chance first to just interact with what you just heard Helga go through.
Sure. I think it's very clear that as the dust settles, people are going to get a much clearer picture of what is actually going on in Ukraine, because you have, President Zelensky, who's, I think, touting his Che Guevara beard. Somebody said he looked like Che Guevara, and he's probably using that to his benefit. By being this liberator in camouflage uniform, defending the country, but in reality, I mean, look what happened in Mariupol, which apparently is now controlled by Russian troops. Probably has been for some time, but you have the holdout of these 2,000 troops in this industrial facility. And they could have surrendered. I mean, several times Russia said, "Okay, look, it's over. You surrender. You can leave. We can work it out so you can survive." And many of them wanted to do that, but the word came from Kiev that you're going to stay there and you're not going to leave. And if anybody tries to leave, this will be considered treason and they will be shot. I mean, that now this is the story. I think there's accuracy to this thing. What is going on here? Because they're still holed up in that. President Putin, of course, seemed to have made the decision now, which I think was, very smart one, saying we're not going to send our troops in there to clean it out because a lot of people are going to get killed, both theirs and ours. They're not going to do anything. They're under siege. It's not going to go anywhere. We'll build a cordon. And if they get to a point where they say they will surrender, then they'll be allowed to leave. And but all of these things, of course, is just coming out in bits and pieces. And I think when we really see it, we're going to see that the real horror show is what's happening to Ukraine and what's happening to the Ukrainian people. Because believe me, we know enough of these reports that those Ukrainians who are not, virulently anti-Russian, viciously anti-Russian, they are considered traitors. Many of them are being shot or are being thrown into jail. I mean, it's a very repressive regime from everything we can see. And that's just not coming out because the media, the Western media, is all working with the same narrative, which is determined by those who really want to continue this war. So I think we're going to see that. The other thing, of course, is what Helga mentioned in terms of the economic situation here. That I had a talk with one of the head of the people in the one of the multilateral development banks this week, who indicated that none of these people are saying anything about what effect is the cost of this war going to have on the ability to finance global development in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. And they're not going public at all because it's a very politically sensitive situation, but they are aware that this is really going to be extremely serious. Now Ukraine is saying that they will need, and I think this is being backed up in terms of reconstruction, something like $14 billion or maybe even more, I don't have the exact figure here, to rebuild the country after this. And of course, what you're going to see is, automatically, everybody in the West, if we do get to some kind of negotiated situation, they're going to be saying, oh, yeah, let's do this for Ukraine. Black Africa, well, they can wait, right? We saw this with the immigrants, right? We had Great Britain says, welcoming all the Ukrainian immigrants. You have some of these immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa, and they work out a deal so that they can go to Rwanda. It's like you place this sign, whites only, right? And you're going to see that also with the general mood. And so that this idea of this global security initiative that President Xi has proposed is very much connected to the global development initiative, because unless we can get a handle on the tremendous costs that are going in to making this war, and also the costs that are going to repair the damage, is going to really go into what we're otherwise trying to do with global development. So the two are very much interconnected, and I think that's what we're going to be seeing down the road. So that was my comment.
Right. So our first question is from Anthony, and he's asking, how critical is the Taiwan situation at this point? And what happened with Hong Kong? Has it calmed down, or is there something else going on there?
Well, Taiwan, there's a lot of narratives going on being foisted on the general public by the same group of characters behind the Ukrainian debacle, which says that China is going to move into Taiwan. This is not true. As a matter of fact, there's probably, I'm sure people, military planners are looking at this situation in Ukraine very, very closely. And they see what has been done simply because the United States was able to get all these other countries to come on board their policy. China is not going to change its policy towards Taiwan, but China is not going to make any kind of abrupt moves, especially not at this point on Taiwan. And I don't think they will do that short of Taiwan at some point declaring their independence. China's policy is to bring down the tension in the world. They're not going to ratchet it up. Some people are saying, China is too close to Russia on this. China has a very close relationship with them, but China is doing everything it can in order to create some kind of negotiated situation between Ukraine and Russia. China also has very close relations with Ukraine. They have a lot of investment there. They would like to continue that. Ukraine also has been, together with Russia, part of the route of the Eurasian land bridge as well, and so that they're interested in that this becomes a peaceful solution. And obviously they're not going to do something in Taiwan. What will Taiwan do? That's also the other issue. Will Taiwan try and use this support that they're getting from the same cast of characters in the United States to make some kind of radical moves on their part? That really, I can't really say what they're going to do, but I don't envision anything seriously happening on their part at the present moment. But obviously from the Chinese side, I think this whole scenario of them moving on Taiwan because Russia moving to Ukraine it just doesn't fit. It doesn't make sense. And the situation with Taiwan is a lot different too, because Taiwan is generally recognized and has been recognized by the United States as being a part of China. But China is still committed to this notion of peaceful reunification. And I think they will do so, except for any major move on the part of Taiwan. Hong Kong is reestablishing itself, I think, quite well. They have had elections. They're going to have a new, what they call head of the Hong Kong office. I think they're dealing with this COVID, really a bad COVID epidemic, and I think they're doing it pretty effectively, and they're getting a lot of assistance from the mainland on that. And I think it has settled down quite a bit in recent weeks, and I think it will remain so. Hong Kong will continue to become a major financial center, and the Chinese who are also interested in relationship with Hong Kong and the financial ties they have will continue to try and build it up as a center and to bring it in closer to the mainland. More exchanges, especially after the COVID epidemic ceases in Hong Kong, bring them to institutions for education, young people for being educated in China, and vice versa, having many Chinese students go to Hong Kong and do it. So I think that's proceeding, I think, in a pretty good direction at the moment.
There are sort of 2 or 3 different questions, all of which deal with or are asking about what is the situation in China in general, Shanghai in particular, around the pandemic, what has happened there, because there's so many different press reports. And for that matter, is there any news on the global health initiative front, or anything further that's been said by Xi Jinping on that or otherwise? So that's kind of the best way to characterize these.
Yeah, on the last one, I'm not exactly sure that if there's been any moves towards implementation on that issue. I'm sure there are discussions that are ongoing with the Chinese within the appropriate international institutions within the WHO and probably also in the UN organization with regard to the health initiative. The situation in Shanghai is serious. Several thousand, I can't remember what the numbers are, but they've really gone up. And China is implementing the same kind of procedures that they had in the Wuhan situation, perhaps more effectively because of what they learned from Wuhan. The city is not shut down. There are certain districts which are more seriously affected than others, and there are more rigorous methods being utilized. There are more restrictions, more quarantine being done there. But the same thing is being done as was done in Wuhan. They're setting up a system of bringing food in, making sure that people have access to that, have access to health care. There's also hospitals are being expanded or being even built up, I suppose, to take care of the people who are affected. And there's massive testing going on. Within the limitations of that, and given the dispersion of the serious cases in different districts in Shanghai, there is also a certain amount of production which is moving forward. I mean, like Tesla has a big plant there. I believe Tesla has come back to full production, and some of the other Chinese companies are also being taken care of. There's also an effort now, because in a city like Shanghai, as in most of these other cities, you have a lot of migrant workers who don't have such a solid footing in terms of social relations and friends and relatives there. And there's a major push being done by the authorities to both get them the testing, get them into a situation where they can live, where their living conditions and their medical conditions are taken care of, to make sure that they do not fall off the grid. So there's major effort going on there. In terms of the country as a whole, there had been the other serious outbreak you had was in the Northeast, which is a big agricultural area, and which is also a major, once upon a time, it was a major industrial center of China. And that has been still a problem there, but it's been receding quite a bit, so that the farmers, and this is the black earth soil in northeastern China, so that the farmers are already, for the most part, going back to their spring planting, so there'd be a harvest next year. And the government is taking a lot of measures. Coal production is moving up. I mean, that the Green Initiative is still in place, and the Green Initiative was a big part of discussion at the Bohai Forum. But in face of the need for energy, they've been really pulling all stops out, especially in the Northeast, to make sure that they have access to that. They're now going to build 6 new nuclear power plants, 3 new programs with a total of 6 new plants that are going to be built for energy supply. And on the economic side, they have reduced the reserve ratio so that there'll be funding available to keep things moving in spite of the fact that the production isn't at full capacity. They're not going to let anything fall apart during the course of this epidemic in Shanghai.
Okay, we have a couple of things here, Bill. Let me give you this question. It's from Sarah. It's basically a comment, but it has a question in it. It says, I am not familiar with how the Belt and Road Initiative was initiated. Perhaps looking into that would be a place to start. In my view, it has far exceeded expectations already. So it's sort of a comment, but with a question involved. So,
right. Well, as you may know, we had a major role in this. Helga and Lynn had a major role in getting the ball rolling. China had a lot of different ideas. I mean, China was in a situation where they were, especially with the collapse of the Soviet Union, they had all these new countries on their borders, and they kind of were already trying to extend the transportation grid to link it up, to a European grid. Previously, everything had gone, of course, through the Soviet Union on the lines that existed then. And so that they were considering building an extension of what they were already doing in expanding the rail lines to the west, which was less developed than the eastern part of the country. And so that they had a program of the Go West program to develop the West, and that linked up to these new countries that came in. And so that existed as something was going on. But in terms of the background to this is that we had, of course, already in the early 1990s that, Lynn and Helga had worked out from the productive triangle, this idea that with the new countries, with the fall of the Soviet Union collapse, we would also try and build lines of rail traffic going in there to bring these countries into the mainstream of commerce. And we, as I understand it, the talks were initially, of course, with the Russians, who had their Trans-Siberian Railroad, and we had a number of contacts with people in the Far Eastern department of the Academy of Sciences, who were very close to the Chinese, and they actually recommended that we talk to the Chinese on these issues, that they would be interested, and indeed they were. And this led, with a lot of back and forth over a period of several years, to this 1996 conference on the Eurasian land bridge, which Helga, of course, attended and spoke at. Lynn, I believe, had a speech that he gave, or it was issued at the conference. And the idea was the new Silk Road, the Eurasian land bridge. This will be, the paradigm for development, similar to what railroads had been with the Trans-Siberian Railroad and the Transcontinental Railroad, as these corridors of development. And this was 96, and I believe that was really the first, obviously the first international conference on this, and probably the first major conference of this nature. And of course, we were instrumental in getting that into motion. And that dovetailed, of course, what the Chinese were doing to some extent on a different level, but also it played into the shift that you had with Xi Jinping becoming a general secretary. There was now this idea that we have reached a certain point as a nation, as a major country, where we also should make contributions to global development. And this was the origin of Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative. But it was there. It was there for a number of years. And of course, 1996, after that, there were a series of very serious economic crises. And so you had a very confusing situation in the economic arena. And then you had the 2008 crisis, which also sent a signal, I think, to the Chinese that this system doesn't work. And I think we don't know the details, but I think there were probably a lot of discussion between 2008 and 2012 that Xi Jinping came in. Discussions going on how do we create a system that does work? And I think out of these different things, you had the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been very successful. I mean, it really changed the nature of the game, because if you look at development policy from, the initial efforts we made in the 1970s with some of these developing countries on the IDB, the International Development Bank, until the present moment, it really all has gone downhill. There were certain spurts, certain things that could have happened during the Reagan administration and didn't really happen for a variety of reasons. But it really hasn't. It's been business as usual, and the business has been detrimental for the majority of the world's population. So that when Xi introduced this proposal and started to implement it, it really created an entirely new dynamic. It was a new trajectory for mankind by the fact of China taking it up. And we really had an integral part in getting this into place because of the early moves that we made with the Chinese on this issue.
Okay,
and they recognize that.
Yeah, right. Yeah. We have a couple other questions. We're going to do something a little unusual. We're going to show something, Bill, which is John Mearsheimer. Mearsheimer is a University of Chicago professor. A lot of people know who he is. And one of the more rational voices in America right now on the question of Ukraine. But he also has this theory that he operates with, which people use different terms for. It's called realism, sometimes called offensive realism. And the idea is that you've got anarchy sort of out there in general, but that if you have superpowers, they try to move toward a more sort of a rationalization of the anarchy by negation. In other words, really is a Kantian theory. And it ultimately means that you've got to run into conflict with other powers, namely, in one case, China. This is him having a discussion with a reporter from CGTN. And the reason I want to play this for people is twofold. One, so that people have an idea what is being, at its best, discussed by elements from the United States academic community, at least, with people in China, at least with the public in China in one sense, because this is CGTN, it's significant in many ways. But then secondly, what the problem is. And I'd like you to, you make some comments about it. So we're going to roll that now and then come back to you.
How do you see the debate people are having regarding your theory that the West has been cornering Russia, which led to the latter's invasion or war against Ukraine?
Well, I think that in the West, especially in Europe and the United States, the mainstream media rejects my argument almost completely. And instead of blaming NATO and the West for precipitating this crisis, they prefer, for obvious reasons, to blame Vladimir Putin. I would note to you, by the way, if you look at the Western Hemisphere, the United States has a Monroe Doctrine. The United States does not believe that countries in the Western Hemisphere have a right to have their own foreign policy. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, when I was young, we did not believe that Cuba had the right to invite the Soviets to put missiles in Cuba. The same basic principle that the United States applies in the Western Hemisphere is the one that the Russians are applying vis-a-vis Ukraine. The Russians view Ukraine becoming a part of NATO as an existential threat. This is why, going back to April 2008, Putin drew a line in the sand. He said, this is not going to happen. This is a threat to our survival. And everything that has happened since then fits that basic paradigm.
Now, here's the thing, you keep on saying existential threat, but now the question is, who would be able to come into the brain of President Putin to understand exactly what's the definition of existential threat?
He thinks that the idea of NATO on Russia's doorstep in Ukraine presents a military and political threat that is simply unacceptable. So I think in this case, there's not much question what he means when he says it's an existential threat. Now, I will point out to you that there are a good number of people in the West who say that it's not an existential threat, that NATO's presence in Ukraine does not threaten Russia's survival. My response to them is, I don't care what they think. The only thing that matters is what Vladimir Putin thinks. And if Putin and his lieutenants think it's an existential threat, we ought to be very careful in dealing with him, because he has thousands of nuclear weapons.
One of the reasons for your argument you cited earlier is that Russia is not looking at taking over Kiev, and yet people have been looking at the military actions that Russia took over there in that city and beyond. So how do you see the reality versus your theory? Many questions.
Well, I think if you actually look at the Russian military operation, it fits very neatly with my theory. Because the conventional wisdom, the argument that the US government and the US media makes, is that Putin was interested in conquering all of Ukraine and making it part of Russia. It is clear, as you say, that he tried to capture Kiev and he failed. But even if he had succeeded, if you couple capturing Kiev with the other gains that the Russians made on the ground, it does not even come close to conquering all of Ukraine.
Tell me more about how do you think this situation could come to an end? What is the best scenario and the worst scenario?
I can only say that I don't see how this comes to an end. And this is the reason. Russia cannot afford to lose. The United States, on the other hand, has decided that it is going to, number one, defeat Russia inside of Ukraine, and furthermore, we're going to strangle Russia's economy. So here we have a situation where Russia has to win and the United States has to win. You know both sides can't win. So what's the solution? I don't know.
So peace is not in sight at all.
Peace is not in sight at all. And I would note to you that there are a number of people in the United States across the political spectrum who believe that this war is going to go on for years. Now, I hope that's not true. I hope there's something that's going to happen that's going to change all this that we cannot foresee. But absent that, I cannot tell you a happy story about how this ends.
So there are multiple matters that can be contested, I would contend, in what he has just stated, but I'd just like you to go and give your observations on this.
Yeah, I was really disappointed when I first saw this, a week or whatever it was ago, although not surprised, given Mearsheimer's somewhat ambivalent statements. Sometimes he says very important things, but he's got his own lens looking through this, and his own lens is really what has been. And I think the issue is, as Helge has been saying, we have to look at a new paradigm. That is, we can't see things in terms of the old paradigm, which of course Mearsheimer is doing. Right? He's saying that it's not going to happen because we're all still thinking in the same way, and there's no new nothing new on the horizon which will change it. And I think this is what is the key thing which separates what we've been doing. I think also what President Xi has pointed out clearly in his statements is also a call for this new paradigm. That is that nations cannot see themselves primarily as rivals, as individual entities which are bumping up against each other all the time. But you have to find the issues that are the common interest of mankind. We had that type of policy here in the United States. Like Franklin Roosevelt, that was his policy. That was his post-war World War II policy, was to create this new paradigm in which nations did not bump up against each other, leading to war, but in which differences that naturally will occur could be talked out in a forum in which all of these nations were involved. And that was the origin of the United Nations. And of course, that's also what China is saying, to use that system. That is the basis of what we can accomplish. It's the platform on which we can accomplish creating a new paradigm between countries. And it's been insistent, especially President Xi in particular, has really made that into the calling card of the People's Republic of China, that there has to be a new paradigm, especially between the major countries, which are the most important countries, to come to a common grounds on all of the major issues which are facing them, but also between the other nations as well. So we can't, the difference with Mearsheimer is that he's still looking through the lens of the Cold War. He says this is the way the world is, and this is the way the world's always going to be, and we're not going to be able to change it. But we have a different one. We are going to be able to change it. I mean, this was the whole role of Lin's existence. And the reason that he simply wasn't totally accepted is that he says, look, we got to do something different here. We have to have new relations between countries. Russia, India, Latin America. The United States has got to, develop good relations with these, and can't remain this kind of cold warrior, or this kind of entity which is at war with everybody else and has to always look over the shoulder. Our problem is that we don't believe, when we're looking at leaders like Xi and others, we don't believe what people are saying, because every time Xi says we need new relations between countries, they say, oh, they're trying to create the system that we create, trying to change the system we created, and he really wants to take over the world. But there is no indication. There's no indication in his whole history of life, and he's been saying these things for a long time. You go back and look at his writings, and he's been very consistent in his worldview on this stuff. And he's saying it quite publicly. And everything China is doing kind of reflects what the United States was doing at one time, say during the period of the Kennedy administration. If we look, for instance, at the space program, people are all hyped up about, oh, China has this space station. The first thing that the astronauts came, when they came down from the last mission, the head of the mission said something about, yes, we want to have international astronauts on our station. And they've opened this thing up. In fact, the Chinese space station, as the foreign ministry spokesman said this week, is the only one that's open to all the nations of the United Nations. Ours wasn't. ISS was not. It was rather restrictive. People do experiments and stuff, but not everybody could be an astronaut on it. And Artemis is going to be even more restricted. Artemis is going to be this alliance of democracy kind of thing. So they're living up to what they're saying. So why mistrust him? But that's what you have to do. I mean, you're not going to get out of this crisis by trying to play, chess with the different pieces. You've got to kind of knock over the chessboard and say, hey, we got to have a different way of getting together and talking about these things. And I think this is what China wants to do. And I think there are a lot of people in the West who also believe that. And I think in the case of the Ukraine crisis, they can play a role. What that role will be is not clear, but they can play a role in terms of this global security architecture, because they have they're trusted by the Ukrainians, I think, and they're trusted by the Russians. They're not trusted by the U.S., and that's the problem. We got to try to bring the U.S. on board. That they would have some kind of a say in trying to find that new paradigm in which these warring countries can begin to look for peace.
We have a final question for you, Bill, but before we go to that, I just have to say a couple things concerning why we showed what we showed. Because normally, had Lyndon LaRouche been alive, he would have not allowed us to show that. Actually, I mean, he might have let a few sentences out, and but let me just say something about this issue of why Lyndon LaRouche detested academia. I mean, thoroughly detested it. You have the problem that was in this in specific of the misidentification of the function of the Monroe Doctrine in specific, that you, among other things that were in this piece, not to mention the fact that when he was asked a simple question of, well, how did we get out of this? He says, I don't know. Unless something unforeseen happens, I don't see us getting out of this. Well, if we don't get out of this, then everything is over. But you see, there's a way in which he and others are trying to avoid the truth that the paradigm is over. The game is gone. There's not a transatlantic system that is going to survive in the configuration that has been there. Really. I'm not talking about now Roosevelt's ideas, but the ideas that have been characteristic of the interplay between the British imperial forces and the United States since the time of World War I, and maybe even a little bit earlier. That's over. And that's not accepted by these guys. They all think that they're going to come up with some construct, some system, some structure, some angle, okay, some hustle that's going to preserve that system. And therefore, anything ever proposed can never be fundamentally even when it may be helpful. And so, that's something that normally, well, we wouldn't have even shown it, but normally we don't have a chance to discuss that. But that's why LaRouche had us do what we do in the way that we're organized, which is not the way that any university is organized or any usual political party is organized or any usual think tank is organized. We never had any form of any type remotely like those institutions. People kept asking us and saying, you've got to become one of these things. And he always opposed that. And I think this is a good example of exactly why. So now I'll give you your final question, since that you can use this kind of to do summary remarks also. This one was from Jose. Let me see if I can get it here. Would it be a fair characterization to say the tides are turning in terms of the narrative shift with the conflict in Ukraine? We see prominent figures now speaking out against NATO and against nuclear war. How can that be accelerated, and at what point will reality become greater than the lies being told? I should reference that we should show our petition at the end of this, by the way. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's also relation to what Jose's question and to what you said is that, the reality is coming forward here in a big way. I mean, what the crisis in Ukraine has shown is that this way of operation that led to the crisis is all bogus. It's all false. It can only lead to war. So it's not simply getting peace in Ukraine. It's really kind of kicking over the chessboard now and saying, look, the old system does not work. And unless we can find something new, it's going to be hell in a handbasket for the human race. And my impression is that there has been such a shock over the war in Ukraine by political layers. And the first reaction, of course, is this anti-Putin stuff. But I think by those who are a little more, have a little more depth, we'll see that first of all, the NATO expansion has been a problem, is problematic. NATO as an institution is no longer relevant to anything. I mean, it can't keep the peace. You know, it couldn't help Ukraine, and it could lead to war if something else comes up like this. So how do you resolve this? So you've got to really reject this. The institution of NATO really has to be somehow disbanded. What you need in terms of this whole discussion of a global security architecture, it's the issue of how do you bring Europe together without war in such a way that everybody's security interest is guaranteed. This is, of course, what the Russians have been saying. This is, what, of course, what China is saying with this global security initiative. So it now is an idea whose time has come. And there are still people trying to live in that old paradigm. But the more they push, the more it's going to blow back on them in terms of increasing rates of inflation, increasing rates of starvation, crashing of supply chains. You're going to have people out on the streets. And unless they do change that, you're going to have people out on the streets really ready to overthrow their governments. I mean, we have the French election coming up, but I don't know who's going to win there, but already now you have tremendous ferment on that. And I'm sure you're going to have that in places like Germany, which has never been really happy about adhering to the NATO line. And you will have it here in the United States. And you saw the contrast between how, these farmers in Iowa, were greeting the Chinese ambassador with open arms and talking, nostalgically about how Xi Jinping had been there. I mean, that you're going to see that in this country as well. People were upset about the wars in the Middle East. Hey, what about this war? How do you think they're going to? That continues in this direction, and if it gets worse there and gets worse here, you're going to see a tremendous reaction. So it's the kind of ferment. I mean, I would even call it, a revolutionary ferment. That is a ferment at a point in which the old system is at an end and the new system has not completely been formed. But we do have the outlines of that in this idea of a new global security architecture. And even the people who are not supporting it at this point, I think as days go on and as the economic effects, the economic, political, and social effects of this crisis, gets worse and worse, they're going to be moving in that direction. And I think that's where we got to be to really kind of show them which way they have to go.
Yeah, we had kind of a late question, which I guess I'm want to give you just so it's done. It's from one of our supporters down in Alabama, who's asking this: is that you're looking at a certain well, I'll try to say it more briefly than it was actually written because it was a long question. The idea is now that we have a kind of understanding in which China has become such a dominant part of the economic scene, and we have the continued interactions with Africa, the continent of Africa, in this realm, in this world of sanctions that we are confronted with, is it possible that we're going to see a realignment of the various nations of what used to be called the Third World? And how can that be done so that that doesn't become a kind of war between, the formerly colonized nations and the colonial nations? Or is that what's about to happen? That's basically the nature of the question.
Well, to some extent, that is happening. I mean, in the sense that the African nations really kind of know to a large extent where their interest lies. Look, the Belt and Road has been extremely beneficial to most of these countries, and it is reached out, I think, to most of the African countries, both sub-Saharan Africa and in North Africa. And so that's concrete. This is concrete help and assistance that they have received for their development. They also see it as something that's beneficial to them because the Chinese are they're non-white, right? And they realize that the world has been controlled by the white Anglo-Saxon oligarchy. And these guys are not white, and they're doing something. They're becoming a major power, so that it also becomes very interesting. But whether or not that becomes a conflict really depends on the attitude of the United States. Look, at one point, John Kennedy, you had pictures of John Kennedy in the African hovels there during the time when we were actually doing development programs down there. He was highly, extremely honored by the African end. But that's all gone. I mean, we've become, like Helga said in her comments, the U.S. has lost its credibility in the Middle East. I think it's also lost a lot of its credibility in Africa. And China is seen largely as a friend. Now, if we try and make an enemy of China, probably we'll make an enemy of them too. But if we follow the lead of the farmers in Iowa and try and have an outstretched hand seriously with the Chinese to work together with them on matters of common interest, including development projects in Africa, then I don't think this is going to become a problem at all. And the issue is that the United States really effectively disappeared from Africa, from African development to a large extent, when the Cold War was over, because there was no competition from the Soviet Union anymore, and so they forgot about it. And now we're trying to go back, but we're trying to go back in a hostile way, where we're trying to tell them you got to work with us and not with them. That's not going to work, because they trust them more than they trust us because of our recent history. So that this is all depending on the attitude of the United States, and it's I think it would be beneficial that we shift policy. Biden can do his big back better world if he has the money for it. Congress is not going to be easy in getting any money for anything in Africa. But I mean, if he does it, then he's got to do it in collaboration with the BRI, and the Chinese want to do that. Look, China does not regard the United States as an enemy. It regards it as the most important partner it could have in the world and would like to work with it. And unless we give them a cold shoulder and say, it will, if you don't play out with our football, we'll leave, and you can be on your own. If we take that attitude, then there's trouble. But if we tell them, okay, look, we would like to work. We'd like to get together with you. We try to work on common interests. We got differences here, but we can work on those too. Then I think that's the only sane thing we're doing. Right now, it's going the wrong direction, but everything's going to be topsy-turvy anyhow in the next few days, so that direction is going to change quite quickly.
Okay, well, Bill, I want to thank you for being with us today. I think people got a lot out of this and certainly got a chance to get several of their questions answered about what is an evolving and complex circumstance, and in one in which, of course, Helga's trying to get her proposal adopted, and we're trying to find voices in the transatlantic world that can actually not just voice the proposal, but actually find ways to have the governments also pick up on that proposal and deal with China and other countries forthrightly. So I want to thank you for being with us today. I want to thank everybody for listening today as well. And we will be, although some had wished me to say something about the ostensible birthday of Shakespeare, sometimes is celebrated today. We sometimes have we had a clip of Lynn we were trying to find, we don't have for you, but we do have something which addresses the matter at hand. And that matter is, just if I can remember how it goes, there is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken leads on to fortune. Omitted all the fortunes of their life are bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves, or lose our ventures. And that's where we are. I think all citizens find that they are in that circumstance, and we have to act that way. We have the ability to change history. We've been talking about that, and that, of course, is what the Schiller Institute conference of April 9th was devoted to. The man who gave his life to doing that, demonstrating to people that they could do that, causing people to think of themselves as, if you will, at the center of the existential crisis facing humanity, Wesleyan and LaRouche. And we're going to conclude with a short clip that some of you have seen before, but it's appropriate to our program today.
The question then is, can we survive it? That's the first question. Is survival possible? Are we going into a dark age? Are we going to find this planet in the middle of the next century as reduced to a population of several hundred million people as it was in the 14th century? Largely through starvation and disease. That's what we face unless there's a solution. All right, is a solution possible? So government has to take a leading part in creating the solution. Fine, that's understood. That's also certain. But the question is, the big question, what can we do about it? Is this something which we must face by sitting back and wondering if Santa Claus is going to bring relief in the sack on Christmas time? Or is this something which we as individuals can shape? Is this something we can affect? And because, and here's where the real thing comes, if we have the power to influence the course of history as individuals, and the choice is between the doom of civilization and recovery from the grip of this crisis, then each of us has a corresponding moral responsibility to muster from within ourselves those capacities which enable us to do our part in shaping the course of civilization. Now, under that rubric, I say the question is, what kind of news is newsworthy? Because if what I'm saying is true, that you represent as an individual person a force which can change the course of history under conditions of crisis, then what kind of news do you need? And the kind of news you need to do your job as an individual, first to understand what's going on, what's happening to the world, and to locate yourself in such a way you can say, well, here's what it is I can do under these circumstances. On the idea that if enough of us each do our particular part, we get out of this mess. Then the only news that's worth having is news which performs those functions, which enables government, which enables you as an individual and so forth, better to understand what is happening to this planet, to understand what the developments are that are shaping the course of history, and finally to indicate to you the facts which you need to look at so that you can judge what it is that you might be able to do which can contribute to bringing about a solution, an escape from the collapse of civilization. This is no pipe dream, this is no fantasy, this is real.